1. d4 immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares to develop the kingside pieces, opening lines for the bishop and queen. This move initiates a flexible response to white's central pawn, preparing to develop the kingside knight and potentially steer the game into Indian defenses, aiming to contest white's central space with piece play and pawn breaks. This move initiates the queen's gambit, a foundational opening where white immediately fights for central control and aims to develop pieces harmoniously while preparing to challenge black's knight. This move transitions into a queen's pawn game, often leading to queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian structures, preparing to challenge white's central pawn with d5. This move develops a knight towards the center, reinforcing control of the d5 square and preparing for further development, often leading into the queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian defense depending on black's response. This move, developing the bishop to b4, immediately creates pressure on white's c3 knight and prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure, often leading into variations of the Nimzo-Indian defense. This move solidifies white's pawn center and prepares for development, aiming for a stable position that avoids immediate tactical complications arising from the Nimzo-Indian defense. Castling is a fundamental safety move, bringing the king to a more secure position and activating a rook, which is standard development in this queen's Indian defense setup. Developing the bishop to d3 supports the central pawn advance and prepares for castling, while keeping open the c-file for potential rook activity. This move initiates a strategic pawn break in the center, aiming to challenge white's central pawn control and open lines for black's pieces, potentially leading to a queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian type structure. This move develops a knight to its natural square, supporting the central pawn push and preparing to castle, while also maintaining flexibility regarding the development of the king's bishop. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines and potentially create an isolated queen's pawn for white, while also fighting for central control in this queen's gambit declined variation. This move, castling, secures the king and connects the rooks, preparing for central pawn breaks and piece development. This move, capturing the c4 pawn, initiates a sharp Catalan structure where white aims to maintain a queenside pawn majority while black seeks to exploit white's slightly compromised pawn structure and potential development issues. This recapture solidifies white's central pawn presence and opens the diagonal for the queen, preparing to develop the queenside pieces. This move resolves the central tension, opening lines for white's pieces while black aims to develop quickly and potentially exploit the resulting pawn structure. This move recaptures the pawn, opening the e-file and reinforcing the central pawn on d4, which is characteristic of many queen's pawn openings and prepares further central development. This move prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b7, which will challenge white's central control and exert pressure along the long diagonal. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing weaknesses in black's kingside pawn structure and preparing to contest control of the center. This move retreats the bishop from the contested center to a safer diagonal where it supports the kingside and prepares to contest control of the long diagonal. This move strategically repositions the rook to the open e-file, aiming to pressure black's central pawn structure and prepare for potential kingside attacks. This move develops the knight to its natural square, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing to potentially contest the d5 square, while also connecting the rooks. This move places the rook on the semi-open c-file, contesting it and preparing to support a pawn advance on the queenside or a potential break with b4. Black reinforces the c-file, preparing to contest its control with white's rook and potentially create counterplay. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, supporting the central pawn push and eyeing the kingside while also maintaining flexibility for potential pawn breaks later in the game. Black exchanges the bishop for the knight, simplifying the position and aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses after the recapture. This capture of the bishop on c3 creates doubled c-pawns for black, which, while a structural weakness, allows white to potentially control the central dark squares and open the b-file for the rook. The queen's relocation to c7 enhances coordination with the rook on c8 and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queenside, while also challenging white's centralized pawn structure. This move proactively challenges black's central pawn control, aiming to break up their pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces, particularly the queen and rook. This move correctly repositions the rook to support the central pawn structure and prepare for potential action on the e-file. The queen's centralization with k2 prepares to support the advance of the c-pawn and potentially contest the open c-file, while also creating a defensive outpost for the queen. This move is a prophylactic measure, seeking to prevent the bishop on g5 from becoming too active or to exchange it, which may resolve positional tensions for black. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing black's queenside and supporting potential pawn breaks. This move exchanges black's lightly defended bishop for white's active knight, simplifying the position and removing a key defender of white's queenside pawn structure. This recapture on f3 aims to recapture material and maintain central control, while also opening the d-file for potential further action against black's queenside. This central pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rook, while challenging white's control of the d4 square. This move repositioning the queen to g3 aims to pressure the weak f7 square, anticipating a potential kingside attack and reinforcing the central pawn structure. Black sacrifices a pawn to open the e-file and activate their pieces, aiming for counterplay against white's slightly uncoordinated setup. This exchange of queenside rook for the opponent's central knight on the d4 square immediately opens the e-file, offering white the opportunity to contest it and simplifying the position. The recapture on e8 with the knight re-establishes material equality and maintains a solid central pawn structure, while also preparing for potential piece activity on the d-file or f-file. This move activates the bishop, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially target black's weakened kingside after white regains the initiative in the center. This move seeks to exploit the weakened light squares on white's kingside and potentially develop counterplay along the c-file, while also preparing to challenge the centralized knight. The bishop repositions to f5, aiming to eye the weak dark squares around black's king and prepare to exchange itself for black's strong knight on d7, which currently defends the e5 pawn. This move repositions the rook to an active central file, preparing to contest control of the open d-file and potentially create pressure against white's queenside pawn structure. This move prepares to support the e-pawn and create a safe haven for the king, while also potentially activating the h3c8 diagonal for future attacking possibilities. This knight move repositions the cavalry to the central square c5, exerting pressure on white's queenside and preparing to support a pawn advance or potential knight outpost. This move reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares to contest the crucial open d-file. a strategic objective for white given black's compromised kingside pawn structure. Black repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to support the d4 pawn and potentially create counterplay on the kingside or center. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to support the central pawn push and potentially control the a2-8 diagonal after white consolidates. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, directly challenging white's central control and preparing to contest the d-file while potentially creating threats against white's kingside. This move shifts the king to a safer square, preparing for potential knight maneuvers or simply to avoid any unpleasant checks that might arise on the g-file or the open d-file. The move 26, kf8 is a pragmatic defensive maneuver, centralizing the king to improve its safety and prepare for potential counterplay, while also avoiding any immediate tactical threats on the kingside. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially creating threats against black's king or supporting further pawn advances. This move opens up lines for black's pieces and creates an immediate tactical threat to white's weak c4 pawn, forcing white to defend and potentially commit their pieces. The queen repositions to f4, centralizing and preparing to contest the crucial diagonal opened by black's last move while also defending the pawn on c4. This move aims to challenge white's central control and prepare to contest the open d-file, potentially leading to exchanges that could simplify the position and activate black's pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the crucial central squares and potentially supporting a pawn advance or attack on the kingside. This move initiates a tactical sequence by attacking the bishop on f5, forcing white to make a decision about its safety and potentially disrupting black's pawn structure. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential tactical opportunities on the queenside and preparing to defend the kingside if necessary, while also keeping an eye on the advanced e5 pawn. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially prepare for a kingside attack or support pawn advances. This move initiates a queenside pawn push to gain space and potentially attack black's queenside structure, aiming to create weaknesses or open lines for white's pieces. This move actively challenges white's central control and seeks to complicate the position by creating imbalances, but it may weaken the d4 pawn and offer white opportunities to exploit the knight's new outpost. The move bg3 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to potentially support a kingside pawn advance or to contest control of the central squares more effectively. The knight repositions to c5, a strong central outpost that attacks the bishop on f5 and prepares to contest the open d-file, aiming to disrupt white's initiative. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing to challenge black's control of the c-file. This move initiates a bold pawn sacrifice, aiming to break open the center and disrupt white's pieces, potentially opening lines for black's rook or queen activity. The move k1 centralizes the queen, unblocking the a2-8 diagonal for the bishop and preparing to support the potential advance of the a pawn or to contest the d-file. Black's move aims to regain lost material by attacking the e5 pawn, which is currently defended only by the bishop on a2, while also centralizing the queen. This move aims to solidify the king's position and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn advance, while also offering some defensive coverage on the f-file. This move aims to attack the undefended pawns on the queenside and open lines for the knight to Infiltrate white's position. This move repositions the rook to an active file, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially support a pawn push or a tactical maneuver against black's disorganized pieces. This move reactivates the rook to the open e-file, putting pressure on white's isolated pawns and preparing to challenge for control of the central files with tactical possibilities. This move 37. QC1 is a strategic regrouping to consolidate white's forces and prepare for potential counterplay against black's advanced pawns on the queenside, while also defending against the threat of black's knight on e3. Black's daring pawn grab neglects development and creates an isolated pawn on d3 for white, but it also allows white to activate their rook on the open c-file and potentially exploit black's vulnerable king. This move creates a vital escape square for the king should black's pieces try to penetrate the queenside, while also potentially preparing for a kingside pawn advance like g4 in the future. The move 38. nc5 repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially pressure white's weak pawn structure after the recent exchanges. The move bf2 is a strategic repositioning, aiming to redeploy the bishop to a more active square where it can support pawn pushes or potentially control key diagonals in the center, preparing for potential piece exchanges and offering better defense for the king. The player retrieves the queen to a safer square, preparing to defend the pawn on c4 and potentially redeploy the queen to a more active position to contest the open d-file or support advances on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the vulnerable c5 pawn and preparing potential future threats along the a2-8 diagonal. With the black king repositioning to g8, it aims to escape the potential danger on the central files and gain a more secure defensive square, while also preparing for future maneuvers or pawn advances by tucking itself away.